I worked at a beauty salon in Manhattan, struggling to make ends meet. The rent in expensive New York was brutal, so I shared a tiny apartment with Devin, a young, outgoing guy who seemed like the typical harmless party animal. He was always talking about the next big party, constantly inviting people over, and every weekend our place would turn into some kind of club. Loud music, alcohol, strangers coming in and out. Sometimes, the parties lasted until morning. It was exhausting, but I put up with it because Devin paid most of the rent, and I didn't want to cause unnecessary problems. At first, the guests seemed normal. One of them looked at me and smiled, muttering, "You're Devin's roommate, right?" I didn't answer, just locked the door. That was the first time I felt real discomfort. A few days later, I confronted Devin. "I know you love parties, but I don't want any strangers or drug addicts in our apartment," I told him. He just smiled indifferently. "Come on, relax. They are fine. Friends of friends." That was the problem. The people coming over weren't really his friends. They were just showing up to drink, do drugs, and get away with whatever they wanted. I began to wonder if Devin even knew their names. One Friday evening, after a long shift at the salon, I came home to find our apartment full of people. At least 20, maybe more. The music was blaring from the living room, the air thick with smoke, cigarettes, marijuana, and something stronger. Empty bottles covered the counters, and the floor was sticky from spilled drinks. One guy was passed out on the floor, another was arguing heatedly over a lighter. A girl, barefoot with wide, wild eyes, as if she were lost, entered my room before I shoved her out. "This isn't safe, Devin," I said. "Not for me, not for you." He sighed and rubbed his face. "Look, just go to your room. Relax. It'll calm down." I stared at him, at the chaos, at the strangers treating our apartment like a secret club. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't trust any of them. Without saying another word, I locked myself in my room and bolted the door. I just had to wait for them to leave. Around 3 in the morning, I was woken by a loud thud at my door. My heart skipped a beat. Someone was pounding so hard that the door frame shook. "Hey, open up," a hoarse voice called from the other side. It was one of the guys I didn't know. I stayed silent, hoping he'd give up. But the banging didn't stop. "Come on, open the door," he insisted, this time with more aggression. I sat on my bed, feeling the tension rise. My body felt frozen, as though it had been paralyzed by fear. I could hear their footsteps just outside the door, pacing back and forth in an erratic rhythm, like they were deciding what to do next. Through the thin walls, I could almost feel their presence, like a heavy, suffocating pressure closing in on me, making it impossible to breathe freely. Suddenly, I felt a hand grip my arm, tight and unyielding. "Hey, beautiful, how about a little fun?" His voice was thick with a hoarse whisper, his breath warm and stale. My heart raced, and I jerked my arm away, but he was too quick, too strong. Before I knew it, his grip tightened again, his fingers digging into my skin. A twisted laugh echoed in the hallway, and before I could react, the second man grabbed me, pushing me roughly onto the bed. I kicked and struggled, my heart pounding in my chest, my body fighting back with everything I had, but it was no use. Their weight and strength were too much. I scratched at their hands, desperate, but they only tightened their hold. "Stop. Please stop," I screamed, my voice breaking, panic rising in my throat. The man above me ignored my frantic cries, as if they were nothing more than a distant murmur. His hands, calloused and rough, ripped at my clothes, tearing them from my body with brutal force. I fought, I screamed, I clawed at them with everything I had, but their strength overwhelmed me. It was like I was being crushed beneath a boulder, unable to move, unable to escape. In the distance, I could hear voices, Devon's voice, muffled and distant, like he was shouting from another world. He was yelling something, but it was drowned out by the deafening thumping of my heart, beating wildly in my ears. His words were lost in the chaos of my own terror. "Help me, Devon. Please." I cried out, but there was no response. The door to my room slammed shut with a deafening crash, sealing me in with them. All I could hear now were their mocking laughs, echoing through the silence like a nightmare that wouldn't end. One of them chuckled darkly. "He's not going anywhere, buddy," he sneered, his words sending a cold chill down my spine. My thoughts were scattered, my mind too frantic to process anything. I couldn't think, I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was drowning in my own fear. My body refused to move. It felt as though my entire being had gone numb, paralyzed by the horror of the moment. I scratched at their hands, but it was useless. The man on top of me grabbed my throat, his fingers closing around it with a pressure so intense that for a moment, I thought I might lose consciousness. The world started to fade, my vision blurring at the edges. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. As they finished, they pulled away from me, laughing cruelly. They wiped their hands on their shirts, as if what had just happened was nothing more than a trivial act, something to be casually dismissed. I lay there, disoriented and numb, my body shaking uncontrollably. My chest heaved with ragged breaths, and I could feel the cold sweat pooling on my skin. "Don't worry, sweetheart," one of them said with a chilling indifference. "Tomorrow, you won't even remember this." His words were like ice, cutting through me, leaving nothing but emptiness in their wake. The door creaked open, and Devon stepped into the room. His face was a mask of indifference, his eyes unreadable. For a fleeting moment, I thought he would stop them, that he would see the devastation and step in to help me. But he didn't. He didn't even look at me. Instead, he turned his gaze to the men, his voice flat and emotionless as he asked, "Everything good?" The man closest to him waved his hand dismissively. "Yeah, man, all good." I couldn't believe it. My mind couldn't comprehend what I was hearing. Devon, who I had trusted, did nothing. He just turned and walked out, leaving me there, still trembling, still paralyzed with horror. The door slammed shut behind him, and I was left in a silence that felt more suffocating than anything else. I was frozen in time, trapped in the nightmare, unable to move, unable to scream. My throat felt raw, as though it had been torn apart. Every part of me ached, but it was a pain I couldn't fully understand, a pain that seemed too big to grasp. When the men finally left, I crept to my phone, my hands shaking so badly that I had to try several times to dial the number. Emily's voice came through the line, soft and concerned. "What's wrong?" she asked, but I could barely speak. "I need help, please, call the police," I whispered, the words barely escaping my throat. I didn't wait for her to respond. I hung up quickly, too scared to hear anything more, too scared to hear any more lies or empty reassurances. Minutes later, Emily arrived. She found me in my room, still frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. It was as though my body had become a shell, a hollow version of myself, unable to do anything but exist in the terror. I sat there, hugging my knees to my chest, unable to move. My world was falling apart, and I couldn't understand what was happening. Emily, noticing how much I was shaking, came over to me, her hands warm and gentle as she carefully placed them on my shoulders. "Are you okay?" Her voice was quiet, but full of concern. I couldn't answer, just shook my head, trying to pull myself together. Everything felt blurry, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. "Listen, you're safe, I'm here," Emily said in a calm voice, and though it seemed like the world would never return to normal, her presence was a small comfort. I tried to gather my thoughts, but again and again, their faces flashed before my eyes, gruff, sinister, their voices, their laughter. I trembled at the memories. Soon, there was a knock at the door. Emily quickly went to open it, and I could barely stand. When the door opened, I saw two police officers, their serious faces only intensifying the fear I could no longer suppress. "You called us?" one of the officers asked. I nodded but couldn't say anything. Emily explained the situation, and they began searching the apartment, thoroughly checking every room. Everything looked as though nothing had happened. The guests were gone, and the apartment was silent, hanging heavy in the air. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't over. They could come back. The officers asked me to explain what happened. I told them everything I could remember, trying to steady my trembling voice. They pulled up the security footage, and I watched the recordings with my heart in my throat. The two guys appeared on screen. I recognized them immediately. They were the same ones who had entered the apartment, tormented me, but their faces now seemed foreign. Distorted. "Are you sure this is them?" one of the officers asked, but I had no doubt. It was them. Exactly the same as in that nightmare. They began checking their records, but as it turned out, there were no files on them. They were strangers who didn't exist in any database. Their tracks had vanished as quickly as they had appeared. "These guys, they are gone," the officer said, his tone tense but calm. "We'll put out an APB on them, but right now, we have no idea where they are." My hands went cold, and I felt panic rising again. I couldn't believe they had just disappeared. "They'll come back," I whispered, but the officers exchanged confused glances. They didn't understand the terror I was feeling. "Don't worry," one of them said. "We'll handle it. We'll find them." But I knew they wouldn't. They couldn't. They were like shadows, gone, and their traces wiped away. After the police left, I remained in the apartment, wrestling with the terror that hadn't let me go. Emily tried to comfort me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching me. That those men were somewhere nearby. That they would come back to get their revenge. Every sound in the apartment now seemed suspicious. Every rustle, was it their footsteps? I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. Every time I looked out the window, I felt like I saw their faces in the darkness. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were close, that their presence was everywhere. And although the police said their search had turned up nothing, I felt like I was losing my mind. All my thoughts were about them. All my fears were about when they would return. At any moment. And even though Emily tried to calm me down, I couldn't rid myself of the feeling that my nights would never be peaceful. I couldn't shake the thought that those guys hadn't just disappeared. They were watching me. And one day, when I was least prepared, they would come for me. I couldn't stop thinking about how they might find me again. What I was doing, where I was going, everything seemed to be on some ominous list, and I couldn't control when they would appear again. These thoughts wouldn't leave me. And they wouldn't, until I felt like I could finally get rid of their shadow. I left the apartment, but not the fear. I packed what little I had and moved to a different city, far away from the memories that still haunted me. I thought the distance would help. I thought a change of scenery would erase the nightmares, the cold dread that clung to me in every corner of that place. But it didn't. The first letter arrived 2 weeks after I settled in. It came in a plain envelope, the type you usually ignore, but not this time. I knew instantly it was from them. I could feel their presence in the way the paper crinkled in my hand. The words inside were simple, yet they struck me with terrifying clarity. We know where you are. It's not over. You can't hide forever. I trembled as I read it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, as though it were trying to escape my ribcage. I thought I had escaped them, but I was wrong. They were still here, still watching, waiting. The darkness from my past had followed me. The letters kept coming, each one more ominous than the last. I tried to ignore them, to pretend like they were just empty threats, but deep down, I knew they weren't. They were out there, somewhere, and they hadn't forgotten about me. I tried to continue living, to make something of myself in this new city. But it wasn't easy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Everywhere I went, every shadow seemed to move with me, every car passing by seemed to be following me. It wasn't just in my head anymore, it was real. Eventually, I had to see a psychiatrist. The constant dread, the anxiety, it was wearing me down. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every doorbell, every knock on the door sent my heart racing. I was on edge all the time, and the fear never stopped. He prescribed me medication to help with the panic attacks, to keep me from spiraling. The pills barely made a dent, but they kept me functional. They dulled the edges of my anxiety, just enough to let me breathe. But it never went away. The nightmares, the constant unease, the feeling that something terrible was always lurking just behind me, they were always there, no matter how many pills I took. The police kept in contact, but even they were growing frustrated. They had their own leads, their own investigations, but every time they thought they were close, the trail went cold. The men I feared had disappeared, just as quickly as they had arrived, and now, no one knew where they were. But they hadn't stopped. The letters were proof of that. In an attempt to ease my fear, they set up a security detail for me, guards at my apartment, surveillance on the streets around me. I had 24-hour protection, but it didn't bring me comfort. If anything, it only reminded me of how deeply I was trapped in this nightmare. I still couldn't sleep at night. The thought that I was being watched, that they were still out there, somewhere, it gnawed at me every waking moment. And it wasn't just paranoia anymore. I knew they were there. I felt it in my bones. They weren't going to let me go. Not until they were done with me. The worst part was the silence. The police could offer protection, but they couldn't take away the constant fear. The letters kept coming, one every few days. Sometimes they were simple, just short sentences, reminding me that they were always watching. Other times, they were more sinister, talking about how they would make me pay for trying to run. I couldn't escape them. No matter how far I moved, no matter how many locks I put on the doors, no matter how much medication I took, the terror remained. And so, I live with it. The fear is my constant companion. The pills, the therapy, the police, they can only do so much. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, afraid that the next knock on the door will be them. I try to carry on with my life, but I can't forget what happened. I can't forget them. It feels like a dream, sometimes. A nightmare that never ends. But then I get another letter, or I see a car that's been parked outside my building for too long, and I know they are still here. And I don't know how much longer I can keep running.